Now, we come to what is probably the most significant, from my perspective at least, Texas-based UFO case. This occurred in December 1980, not too far from the Big Thicket, ironically. It's become known as the Cash-Landrum UFO incident, and that's the cover of a book written by a guy named John Schuessler. John looked very, very deeply into the story of this particular case, which, as I said, occurred on December 28th, 1980, not too far from the Texan town of Huffman. And two women and a young boy were driving home after a late night dinner, and they saw this strange light in the sky. Bear in mind, they were sort of going down a country road. It's very dark, you know, there's not many street lights, just fields and woodlands surrounding them. And they suddenly saw this light in the sky. They had no idea what it was, but they described it as somewhat diamond-shaped, as you can see from that picture. Now, as it got closer, it took on even more of like a definitive diamond-type shape. And they had no idea what it was. They were terrified. They brought the car to a halt, and they actually weren't that far in front of the object, which came really low on the ground, had this light coming out from underneath it, which lit up the tarmac of the highway, or the little road, I should say. And they got out of their vehicle because they suddenly felt this sort of overwhelming, oppressive heat inside the car. You know, they just had to get out. They jumped out of the car, and one of them, Betty Cash, hence the name Cash-Landrum. Betty Cash was the one person who sort of walked closer to this particular object. She didn't know what it was. She got very, very close to it, and you know, it was emitting all this heat, etc. Well, as they continued to watch this object, they suddenly heard this beating sound in the sky and saw like an entire squadron of double rotor helicopters, black helicopters, appear on the screen. And as you can see on John's cover, there's a double rotor helicopter on the left and on the right, just to sort of demonstrate the presence of the helicopters. But the witnesses counted, they thought there were 23 helicopters. Now, the big question is, what did they see and what was the reason for the presence of the helicopters? Well, that's one of the most important questions. The other one relates to the witnesses themselves. For example, I mentioned how Betty Cash actually got quite close to the object. Well, within days, she actually fell seriously ill. Her hair started to fall out in clumps. She developed sores, and eventually, unfortunately, she died of breast cancer. And this has given rise to the idea that the object was either radioactive or was possibly even was giving off some sort of like a chemical, maybe, like an aerosol-based chemical that affected her health. We'll probably never know, unfortunately, but she was encouraged to take legal action against the military. But unfortunately, that didn't, from her perspective, that didn't hold up because, you know, nobody could find out where these 23 helicopters had come from. So that part of the story really stalled. But the big question is, what was the UFO? Now, in the UFO research community, there are sort of two theories as to what the object may have been. One is that it was a genuine UFO that was malfunctioning, and the presence of the helicopters was, if you like, a kind of a quick reaction military unit that was designed to recover the object. If it sort of severely malfunctioned and crashed, then the helicopter crews would move in, seal off the area, and possibly even be responsible for sort of lifting the aircraft out of the area. Now, excuse me. That's the primary two witnesses. That's Betty Cash on the right, and as I said, the hair just started to fall out in clumps. Days afterwards, she felt extremely ill. That is the particular type of helicopter, a Chinook, which the witnesses described as being present, except they were just totally black. And military agencies, you know, do have sort of quick reaction teams to respond to emergency events. And one of them, a famous one, was known as Project Moondust. This was a program that the Air Force set up in the 50s, and which was really active in the 60s to recover things like Soviet space rockets and satellites that had fallen to Earth, you know, because we want to see what the Russians were doing. So they would send these quick reaction units in. The other theory that's been suggested is that the object may not have been a UFO, but was possibly some sort of nuclear-powered aircraft of the military. And the idea was that the military may have been test flying some sort of prototype nuclear-powered craft. It started to malfunction, and the team was there, again, not to sort of retrieve it in the same way you would a UFO, but to sort of retrieve a malfunctioning object of the military itself. And even to this day, the UFO community is very much sort of split on the nature of whatever happened to them, but something clearly did. And other witnesses have come forward to say they saw the helicopters as well, other people saw the craft. So it was clearly a genuine incident, and for me at least, without doubt the most significant of all the various Texas cases that have gone on over the years. And through the Freedom of Information Act, the military has released hundreds of pages on this particular case because they were very concerned. You know, they were worried by the fact that, you know, somebody was making a claim that they'd been essentially sort of irradiated by the presence of this UFO, which may well have been sort of nuclear powered. And particularly when it went to a court case, you know, there was major concern. And it was never really resolved. But one of the interesting things is that just barely 24 hours before this incident occurred, there was what is probably Britain's most famous UFO case occurred in a place called Rendlesham Forest on the east coast of England. And there actually are some weird parallels between the Rendlesham Forest case and this one. For example, the nearest Air Force base to Rendlesham Forest is called Bentwaters, or was, it's closed down now. And Bentwaters was where the guys were based, the military guys were based, who had this UFO experience in Rendlesham Forest. Well, it so happens that the same base, Bentwaters, was home to a quick recovery-based unit which used helicopters, which were on standby to recover astronauts in the event that in the Apollo missions the craft malfunctioned and crashed. And if they landed in Europe somewhere, or crash landed in Europe, this retrieval team would go out from RAF Bentwaters to recover the Apollo astronauts. What's interesting is that although they were based at Bentwaters, their original headquarters was actually at the NASA headquarters in Houston, and Houston was barely like 40 miles. The headquarters was barely 40 miles from where this incident occurred. So one of the theories is that the object that came down in Rendlesham Forest may have been sort of clandestinely shipped across to the United States, or even flown, because it was described as being a small object. And that what we might have seen is the object then being transferred when it reached the US mainland, possibly to somewhere in Texas for study. The time frame, even the sort of the diamond pyramid type shape that's been described to the Rendlesham Forest object, parallels quite closely the Cash-Landrum UFO. And as I said, the time frame also is an important factor. You know, just barely 24 hours later, we've got these two military issues, if you like, both in relation to quick reaction units, one of which occurred in England but has its headquarters in Houston, which, as I said, was barely, 40 miles from where this incident occurred. So I do think there could be a potential tie-in here, but again, whether that means it's a UFO or some sort of secret object, I mean, that's a different thing entirely.